No, artificial intelligence is not neutral. Yes, human biases propagate into AI. As humans do, AI systems also mirror gender prejudices and stereotypes in their algorithmic decisions. This is why it's crucial to consider the impacts of human perceptions on data collection. So there is a necessity for an intersectional approach to AI development and data training, and for a stronger presence of women in tech and AI. But how can we develop AI in a way that promotes equality, transparency, and accountability with a special focus on women? How can we ensure the protection of gender equality and non-discrimination in AI systems? And how can we empower women in tech and AI? To look into all these important questions, I'm joined by Ivana Bartoletti, Global Chief Privacy and AI Governance Officer at Wipro. I'm Kiorri, and this is Communicating Democracy, the EuroPCom podcast on public communication. So Ivana, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you.
So starting with a €1,000,000 question, why is it important and how can we empower women in tech and AI?
Yeah, I mean, $1 million question. So there was a survey that I saw recently, which basically said something that really struck me. It basically said 68% of women do perceive themselves as tech leaders. Mm-hmm. However, only 53% of men recognize them as potential tech leaders. So what struck me, once again, I mean, it's not really surprising, is it? but what struck me in relation to technology is this perception that is, we perceive ourselves as we can be leaders, but is discrepancy between what we are perceived. So the context that doesn't perceive us as tech leaders, and this is problematic to an extent. And because to me, it's not just about women coders. Of course, it's about women coders, but it's far more than that. It's about the policy making, right? It's about the top of company businesses where we decide which AI we're actually producing. So can we make a switch? Can we improve these tools so they actually support the cognitive capabilities? This is where I mean that the diversity and inclusion is important because, this is about the direction of travel. So it's not easy for women in this area. It's historical. Is geographical because it wasn't always like that. Women coding was considered as knitting in the past. And this is why a lot of women were doing knitting because it was very similar to secretarial jobs. And it's very, very regional in the sense that if you go to other parts of the world, you see a lot of women doing these jobs. So it's probably we pay the burden of this sort of scientific culture versus humanistic culture as if they're two separate worlds, which they're not, and we pay this, right? I remember on my own skin when I was a student, you go to classics, you go and study the classics, and I grew up in Italy as women, But and by the way, when I asked ChatGPT at the very beginning to tell me a story about a boy and a girl deciding what to do at university, ChatGPT basically said the boy wants to do maths and the girl wants to do art because she does not understand numbers. So then this bias gets replicated into these machines. So yeah, it's not an easy one to crack, but it's very important to see it's not just about the coding. It is very much wider than that. It is about the policy making and the top of company businesses. So I think it's fair to say that we are at a crossroads. In the sense that over the last few years, we have seen some really amazing stuff that AI is doing and holds a lot of promise. I mean, look at all different sectors from healthcare to manufacturing, automotive, and as well as the enhancing of our productivity within work. But if you look at it now with the arrival of agentic AI and the risks that they could pose in terms of security, privacy, interaction with the world. I think when I say we are at crossroads, it means that this is the time where we really have to look into AI governance and how we ensure that the benefits of AI are equally distributed and that these benefits reach out to people. But in terms of wider inclusivity, I think this is where the focus ought to be.
And what steps do you see from your experience, you witness being taken so far?
Yeah. So I think governance of AI comes in so many different levels, obviously. Okay. So there is the enterprise governance, there is policy, there is legislation, there are international framework standards. It's difficult to say, what is, which one is we're pinpointing to. But I think it's there are different elements here. One is the sort of business governance and in industry, right? What are companies doing to ensure that they create AI that people and as well as businesses can trust, right? And that part of this trust, there is also the fact, that there has this AI, in order to be trustworthy, has to be inclusive. The data has to be worked on. There has to be privacy, cybersecurity, and legal protection in the design if we want then people to trust and companies to trust and use these tools. There is also a lot of stuff happening on a more international level. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, about what the rise of open source can mean in terms of inclusivity in relation to the democratization of AI. And then obviously there is the legal side of it, which is, for example, we have AI does not exist in a legal vacuum. And by, for example, how do we apply non-discrimination legislation? And the most important one for me and is privacy law. Like, how do we empower the dignity of people through privacy? So, we have to look at this broader spectrum.
So what has been done in terms of policymaking at the top of company businesses? What shift do you see there? Do you see any shift to begin with?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, because we're living in this society, and I'm sure you're very, you report on these things, right? So you're very well aware, like when there is the one hand, the idea that innovation, and that any regulation of any break can be detrimental to innovation and to deployment at high scale. And on the other hand, the complete different vision where, without innovation, without regulation, we can't really innovate. And I think, Europe, for example, is trying to find a way in the middle. On the one hand, it has the European AI Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, which I defend very much, which I think it can be improved, obviously, but there is a reason why it is under so much attack, which is, and I want to say it clear, is one of the few legislation that protects individuals from the harms of AI, including women, because privacy is very much related to equity. But I think companies are realizing that regardless of the legislation, regardless of the debate about whether governance matters or not, right, they're realizing that actually AI carries risks on cybersecurity, on privacy, risks of attacks, and the more complex it becomes, think agentic AI, the more governance is actually a requirement. And if they want to progress with innovation, they have to deploy products that they can trust. They have to deploy products that people know that are safe. And if they do develop their products and they use, for example, in-house or they sell, they also have to produce and sell things that people can trust. So they have to be transparent. They have to give technical documentation. At the end of the day, we'll have open source, closed source, whatever. But at the end of the day, people and consumers and businesses will only use products that they can trust. So business are, regardless of all the rhetoric, but this is what businesses face day in, day out.
Right. And it is important to put in the market products that consumers can trust. But how do we go from this theory to actually making it practice?
Yeah.
And how can we also, this is the second part of the question, but how can we remove gender bias in AI to ensure more inclusive and representative AI systems?
Yeah. So on the first question, yes. Think about the European AI Act, right? The European AI Act says before you market something which is high risk, then you have to demonstrate this. You demonstrate it either with technical documentation or when we will have the standards with adherence to the technical standards, right? So this is very much rooted into product safety legislation with the twist, as you know, of fundamental rights, right?
Right.
This is also what is making the standards a little bit complex, because you can't just say, I'm going to use ISO standards or NIST, because they don't have the element of the fundamental rights embedded. Now, so this is really important. It's like, we've been debating this for a very long time, but to an extent, it's like going on an airplane, that you want the airplane to be tested. Otherwise, I'm not getting on an airplane if I know that is someone that's just created it without any standards. So that's one thing. I do have reservations of some elements of the European AI Act. For example, how easy it is to avoid being labeled as high risk. However, I want to state once again that the European AI Act is not the universal law of AI, especially when it comes to those products like the algorithms that are used to hire and fire people, or the algorithms that are used to decide whether you can have access to a loan or not. Because actually, there is another piece of legislation that matters very much, which is privacy law. And if you look at the recent judgments of in relation, for example, to credit, assignment of credit or credit scoring, where they define what is an algorithmic decision, right? At the beginning, there was so much rumor saying, the GDPR does not protect from algorithmic decision making, and it does. It really does. And this leads me to your second question, because look, privacy is also very important when it comes to this, because the fact that I can, if a decision is made over me, right, by a machine, I need to be told that decision is made by a machine. I need to be given an explanation. I can challenge it. And on top of all that, I do have the right to know which data has been used. Okay? I do have the right to access my own information. This transparency is very, very important also when it comes to bias. Now, on bias, we're also probably a bit tired of talking about it for one reason, because bias is not technical, obviously, right? There is not, you can't respond to technically to something that is actually there in society. There are few women engineers. You want to recruit a women engineer, the output is male. I mean, it just happens because the data is what it is. However, the question is different. The question is whether we want in Europe to use AI is in an aspirational way. Do we want to be aspirational? So do we want to use AI? That means, for example, massaging the data, using synthetic data to help us reach an aspiration. So that's changing the output based on the aspiration that we want. But that is not a technical solution. That is a political one. And at this present times, maybe that is a bit more complicated. Just a little bit.
Yeah. Because you mentioned the algorithmic decisions and the bias, and do you think AI is being influenced by the real pragmatic environment that we are experiencing around us? And how does the gender bias in society get reflected in AI? You already gave some explanation on that, but maybe you can give us some more examples.
Yeah.
And we're talking about, does the EU want to be aspirational about changing this course? But how can creators move away from these biases?
Yeah. No, there are many different ways. Bias comes in many different ways. It comes because of the data that you use. Developers will say garbage in, garbage out, right? Which we've all heard. So it comes from the data. Of course, the data is a picture of society. You take this data, you give it in to the machine. The machine will just replicate, and I would argue crystallize or softerize the existing inequalities into decision-making products that make decisions about us and the future. So to an extent, they freeze the present and the past into these decisions, right? Which is quite complex and difficult to accept. We want the world to change, not to remain the same. But it's not just that. It's also the parameters that you choose. If I choose a parameter of what I consider as being a good employee, then obviously it's not neutral. I make a decision as somebody in there. So AI, but also you can train a product in Brussels and then deploy in Frankfurt, and the output might be biased because the context is different, right? So bias comes in from many, many different reasons, but mostly comes in because the world is what it is. And so there are ways of addressing it technically. So for example, you can say, well, actually, I don't have enough information about women, and I'm going to create this information. I'm going to create it because I want the data to be representative, not just of reality, but the reality that I will want to be. That's what I mean by being aspirational. Yeah. However, we still have an issue, which is the fact that the European AI Act says, for example, yes, you can use very sensitive data such as race, such as religion, in order to be able to assess these systems to see if they're biased. GDPR is a little bit more restricted when it comes to this data. This is where it's a little bit of a shame that the privacy world wasn't involved when the European AI Act was created, because you can't be blind. If I want to test an algorithm, I need to know whether, for example, information about race, because how otherwise can test it? How can I see if he's biased against, say, for example, women? I mean, look at facial recognition, which is notoriously biased towards women of color. So what I'm trying to say is it's really important to assess these systems, to train them. But once you've trained them, to audit them and to check and validate. And also within companies, I always say to people, if you feel that there may be bias, even if I've done all the possible checks, do raise your hand and say. So reward people spotting things rather than silencing them. I think this is really, really important.
I agree. So we're talking about the role of the EU and all the legislation that it has taken so far. But if we were to talk about specific steps that the EU has taken, some things that worked or didn't work, what would you say is the direction?
Of course, Europe now is looking at all various legislation and see if there is any redundancy and sort of the streamlining of European laws to make sure that there is no redundancy. And that's fair enough. I mean, the fact that the general data protection regulation was applied in different ways across different countries is a major problem. And if we want leverage to European power, we want the European AI Act to be applied across countries in the same way so that we can act as one, which is, and I think it's really important that we don't lose track of the competitive advantage that we can have in bringing together innovation and responsibility. And especially now where, the topic of sovereignty is so crucial, I think bringing together innovation in an intelligent way, innovation and responsibility in an intelligent way, can be a huge competitive edge for the EU.
Ivana, thank you very much for joining me and explaining how and why it is important to empower women in tech and AI. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode of Communicating Democracy. And if you want to discover more about the link between democracy and technology, check out our EuroPCom podcast series. And of course, if you like this episode, feel free to share it with your network. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time. This is a podcast series of the European Committee of the Regions. For more information on EuroPCom, please visit the website co.europa.eu.